The sun was just beginning to dip behind the hills when I opened the mailbox and saw the letter. Thick, cream-colored paper, embossed logo, return address from a homeowners association I'd never heard of. I wasn't expecting anything official, just the usual stack of flyers and maybe a bill or two, but something about the envelope made my stomach tighten. I tore it open while still standing by the mailbox, the dry wind kicking up little puffs of dust around my boots. Inside was a demand, $350,000 in unpaid HOA dues, penalties, legal fees, and recovery costs. The letter claimed my property had been under their jurisdiction for years. According to them, I was responsible for everything from maintenance of common areas to improvements I'd never heard of. They even mentioned the use of a private clubhouse and landscaped trails, things I had never seen, let alone used. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. A misaddressed letter, a glitch in some bureaucratic system, but there was no mistake. The letter referenced my name, the legal parcel number, even the fact that I'd inherited the ranch from my grandfather 3 years earlier. I hadn't touched the land since then. It was a quiet, forgotten stretch of earth at the edge of a small town, 50 acres of scrub, fence posts, and weathered memories. My grandfather had owned it since before I was born, and he always made it clear no one told him what to do with his land. That land was ours, untouched, unclaimed by anyone but our family. And yet, here was this letter, bold as anything, claiming dominion over what was never theirs to begin with. I didn't know it yet, but this was just the beginning. I sat at the kitchen table, the letter spread out in front of me like some kind of legal landmine, rereading every word, hoping, begging for a line that proved it wasn't real. But there it was, black ink on thick stock, the HOA demanding I pay $350,000. Not just dues, but penalties, interest, attorney's fees, and what they described as mandatory contributions to shared infrastructure upgrades. They even claimed I owed for repainting a gate and resealing a private road I'd never driven on. Every line of it sounded more absurd than the last, yet it was written with such confident authority that it almost felt real. I flipped to the second page, where the numbers were broken down. 10 years of back dues, somehow calculated at nearly $1,000 a month, plus fines for non-compliance, failure to attend meetings, and failure to submit landscaping plans. Landscaping plans. The ranch didn't even have plumbing, let alone a manicured lawn. It was open land, the same wild, dry acreage my grandfather had loved for decades. No neighbors, no fences but ours, and certainly no HOA, until now. They threatened that if I didn't pay within 60 days, they'd place a lien on the property and begin foreclosure proceedings. The tone was aggressive, smug even, as if they were used to people folding under the pressure, as if I were just another absentee landowner who wouldn't bother to fight. They even included a payment portal link, like it was a phone bill or parking ticket. I called the number listed, expecting some mistake to be cleared up quickly, but the woman who answered was curt, almost robotic. She confirmed the amount and said the HOA had voted unanimously years ago to include my property within the community. Voted. As if that gave them any right. I told her the ranch wasn't in their development, never had been. She paused, then told me I'd need to take it up with legal if I disagreed. Then she hung up. I stared at the phone in my hand. Anger surged through me, not just at the demand, but at the arrogance behind it. They thought I'd roll over, write a check and vanish. But they didn't know the land they were trying to bully me off of was never theirs to touch. 2 days later, I packed up my truck and headed out to the ranch. I hadn't been back since the funeral, my grandfather's boots still hanging on the porch where he'd left them. The road out was the same dusty stretch I remembered, cutting through hills and mesquite, the kind of landscape that doesn't change for anyone. But as I approached the edge of the property, something felt off. The narrow dirt path leading up to the ranch had been replaced by smooth pavement, freshly lined and flanked with trimmed hedges. I slowed down, confused. A polished wooden sign read, "Whispering Trails, Private Community." I almost laughed. Further in, I passed a series of identical stucco houses with solar panels and manicured lawns, the kind of place where people drink wine on porches and complain about mailbox colors. My stomach sank as I realized these weren't just neighboring homes. Some of them sat dangerously close to the edge of my land. I kept driving until I reached the old gate. It was gone. In its place stood a modern metal fence with a keypad and a freshly poured walkway cutting through what used to be our front lot. I parked and walked the boundary, boots crunching over gravel someone else had laid. My grandfather's land, his rugged, honest patch of earth, was littered with walking trails, a tennis court, and even a small playground. Sprinklers hissed softly, spraying water over flower beds that had no business being there, and all of it, every inch, was on my side of the boundary, at least based on what I remembered from the maps Grandpa used to show me. My chest tightened as I stared at a picnic pavilion built right where our horse barn once stood. Not a single person was out, but I felt eyes on me, watching from behind blinds. I wasn't supposed to be here, not according to them. But I wasn't trespassing, they were. And I knew then, whatever this was, it wasn't just a mistake. This was a quiet takeover, and I was going to find out exactly how it happened. The next morning, I drove into town and walked into the county records office with a purpose I hadn't felt in years. The place smelled like paper and old wood, filled with the quiet hum of fluorescent lights and the rustle of documents being shuffled. I told the clerk at the front desk I needed to see the historical property maps and land surveys for my grandfather's ranch. She gave me a skeptical glance but pointed me toward the archives room. A part of me hoped this would clear everything up, that maybe there was some clerical hiccup that tied our land to the HOA by accident. But what I found told a very different story. The oldest plat map I located was dated over 50 years ago. It showed the ranch's full borders, nearly 50 acres of uninterrupted space, carved long before the nearby developments began popping up. No mention of any homeowners association, no easements or shared property agreements. I pulled up newer maps, one from 15 years ago that showed a subdivision creeping up to the ranch's border, but not past it. Then came the most recent one, dated just 5 years back. This one was different. The lines blurred. The HOA's common area extended nearly 20 yards into what used to be clearly designated ranch land. It was subtle, almost clever, but not clever enough. I requested a copy of the original deed, signed in thick black ink by my grandfather himself. It stated clearly the full boundaries and emphasized that the land had no covenants, restrictions, or obligations to any local or private organization. That language was ironclad. I felt a firelight in my chest. My grandfather had always been careful, stubbornly so. He didn't believe in giving up control of what was his, and now I saw why. Back at home, I laid out the documents on my dining room table, comparing every line and lot. What began as suspicion had hardened into certainty. The HOA had pushed into our land, built on it, beautified it, and now had the nerve to bill me for the privilege. They weren't just overreaching, they were trespassing, and it was time someone reminded them whose land they were standing on. I didn't waste time. The next morning, I sat in the polished office of a property attorney named Daniel Reyes, a sharp, no-nonsense man with a reputation for being both meticulous and relentless. His walls were lined with case files and framed court wins, and when I laid out the letter from the HOA, the deed, the plat maps, and the survey discrepancies, he didn't blink. He listened quietly, tapping a pen against a yellow legal pad, occasionally raising an eyebrow as I explained how the HOA had claimed my land, built on it, and then sent me a $350,000 bill for their trouble. When I finished, he pushed his chair back slightly and said, "They've overstepped in a big way." His tone wasn't panicked, just calculated, like someone seeing the pieces of a puzzle come together. He explained that HOAs have no legal right to annex or impose dues on a property without formal consent, usually through deed restrictions or signed agreements. The fact that they had built structures without permission, used the land for public benefit, and then attempted to charge me for it wasn't just unethical, it was potentially criminal. Daniel agreed to take the case and immediately drafted a cease and desist letter. It was sharp and cold, outlining their violations and demanding they halt all activity on my property. We sent it certified mail to the HOA board and their legal team. Within days, the response came back. Not an apology, not an offer to negotiate, but a firm denial and a fresh warning. They claimed full rights, doubled down on their lien threats, and advised that if I failed to comply, they would initiate foreclosure. Daniel smirked as he read their reply. "They're bluffing," he said, "and they're about to lose a lot more than they bargained for." With the legal wheels turning, Daniel insisted we get a current, professionally certified survey done, one that left no room for ambiguity. I hired a respected land surveyor from the next county over, someone with no ties to the local HOA or their development. Within a week, his team was out on the ranch, marking boundaries, setting up tripods, and comparing GPS coordinates to the original deed and county records. I watched as orange flags began appearing, bright little beacons of truth lining the edge of what was rightfully mine. The results came back fast and definitive. Nearly a quarter of the HOA's common area, about 5 acres, had been built directly on my land. The tennis court? Half of it sat across my property line. The walking path? It snaked well into my pasture. Their prized community garden and picnic pavilion, smack in the middle of the northeast corner of my grandfather's ranch. There was no question, no confusion. Their so-called amenities weren't just touching my land, they were planted deep in it. Daniel compiled the report, complete with satellite overlays, historical property boundaries, and a notarized declaration from the surveyor. It was more than enough to bring to court. It was ironclad. We sent copies to the HOA's board and their attorney, this time with a warning of our own. Remove all encroachments immediately or face a formal lawsuit for trespass, unlawful use, and property damage. The tone was no longer passive. We weren't asking, we were telling. Their reply came late at night via email, casual, dismissive, and laced with arrogance. They claimed the survey must be wrong, that the land had been maintained by the HOA for years, and that usage implied acceptance. Daniel almost laughed when he read that. "They just admitted it," he said. "They've been using your land and now they think squatters' logic will hold up in court." The next step was to file a formal complaint with the county zoning board and the state's real estate commission. What had started as a ridiculous letter was now spiraling into a full legal storm. But for the first time I didn't feel overwhelmed. I felt ready. I had the truth, the documents, and now the proof, and I was done playing defense. News of the dispute didn't stay quiet for long. A local reporter caught wind of the story after overhearing a conversation at the county office and reached out for an interview. I agreed, thinking maybe a little sunlight on the situation would make the HOA think twice. By the end of the week, the story was everywhere. Headlines reading, "HOA sues ranch owner for $350K, gets sued back for trespassing," and "Man fights back after HOA builds on inherited land." The public ate it up. Social media lit up. People who'd tangled with overzealous HOAs before shared their own horror stories. Strangers emailed to say they were rooting for me. Some residents of the very subdivision causing all the trouble reached out in disbelief. They had no idea that part of their peaceful community park was built on stolen land. A few were embarrassed. Others were angry, not at me, but at the board for dragging them into a legal mess they didn't sign up for. At the next HOA meeting, tempers flared. Someone leaked a video showing frustrated homeowners demanding answers. The board looked rattled. Their president, a man named Hal Carmichael, tried to calm the crowd, but the damage was done. A petition began circulating demanding the board resign. Some residents even suggested the HOA should pay to lease the land or relocate the amenities altogether. But it was too late for deals. Daniel and I watched all this unfold with cautious optimism. Public sentiment didn't decide lawsuits, but it did make people nervous, especially boards that rely on support to stay in power. For the first time since this all began, it felt like the tide was turning. What they tried to bury was now front-page news, and the world was watching them squirm. It started with a loud knock at my door, an official from the county sheriff's office standing there with a stack of papers. The HOA had followed through on their threat and filed a lawsuit demanding full payment of the $350,000. They accused me of breaching a community covenant, despite the fact that no such agreement had ever been signed, recorded, or acknowledged by me or my grandfather. Their case hinged on the idea that my land had been incorporated into the HOA jurisdiction years ago through something they called implied inclusion. According to them, my failure to object earlier meant I'd accepted their authority. It was desperate logic wrapped in legal jargon. Daniel took one look at the complaint and shook his head. "They're reaching. They're hoping you'll settle out of fear." but we had no intention of backing down. Within the week, we filed a countersuit: trespassing, unauthorized land use, destruction of private property, and unjust enrichment. We also demanded removal of all structures, financial compensation, and punitive damages. We didn't just want to win, we wanted to make it clear that you can't steal land and bully someone into submission without consequences. Pre-trial hearings began a month later. Their attorneys tried to delay, reschedule, bury us in paperwork. Daniel met them at every turn with firm rebuttals and ironclad documentation. The judge wasn't amused by their tactics. In one hearing, she openly questioned how an HOA thought they could claim land without consent. "You don't get to vote yourselves a new neighbor," she said. It was the first time I saw the board's legal team visibly flinch. Meanwhile, the cost of their defense was starting to mount, and the board members were feeling the pressure from within their own community. Their bluff had been called. They had walked into this fight believing I was just one man against their machine. But they forgot that the law, when properly applied, doesn't care about neighborhood politics. It only cares about the truth. The trial date was set, and as we prepared to take this to court, I felt something deeper than anger: resolve. They had built on my land. Now I was going to tear down their case brick by brick. The courtroom was packed on the morning of the trial. Local reporters lined the back row, notebooks in hand, while members of the HOA sat stiffly on one side of the gallery, whispering among themselves. I sat beside Daniel, calm but focused, dressed in a suit that hadn't seen the light of day since my grandfather's funeral. Across the aisle, the HOA's lead attorney adjusted his tie and leafed through a binder thick with arguments. But behind all their noise and paper, they had one fatal flaw: we had the truth. The judge, a woman known for her sharp demeanor and intolerance for nonsense, entered and wasted no time getting to the facts. The HOA's opening argument was layered with language about community standards, inherited responsibility, and land stewardship. They tried to paint me as an absentee landowner, refusing to contribute to the common good. But when it came time to produce a deed, contract, or agreement binding my property to the HOA, they had nothing. Not a signature, not a plat note, just a vague timeline and a flimsy claim that usage equaled consent. Then Daniel stood and began laying out our case. He presented the original deed with my grandfather's signature, the certified survey showing clear encroachment, photos of the structures, and testimony from the county records clerk verifying there was never a legal annexation. With every slide on the screen, you could feel the confidence draining from the HOA's side. The judge asked pointed questions. When did they believe the land was absorbed? Why hadn't they filed a legal change of boundary? And why had they begun construction without verifying ownership? By the end of the day, the answer was obvious to everyone in the room. They had assumed they could get away with it. When the judge finally spoke her ruling, it was decisive. The HOA had no legal claim to the land. They were ordered to remove all structures from the property within 90 days, pay for the damage caused, and cover all court costs and attorney fees. I didn't smile. I just nodded. Because this wasn't about revenge. It was about standing my ground, literally, and making sure no one could rewrite history with concrete and a vote. News of the verdict spread fast. By the time I left the courthouse, my phone was buzzing with messages from neighbors, old friends, even strangers who had followed the case online. Some offered congratulations, others just wanted to say thank you for standing up to something that felt bigger than one person's fight. The HOA board, on the other hand, looked like they'd just been hit by a truck. Their attorney rushed out before the cameras could catch him. Hal Carmichael, their smug president who had once sent me that threatening letter, avoided eye contact as he left through a side door. A week later, he resigned. Crews began dismantling the encroaching structures not long after. The playground came down first, then the tennis court. Piece by piece, the land was returned to what it was always meant to be: untouched, open, and mine. I watched it happen from the tailgate of my truck, arms crossed, boots planted in the soil my grandfather once walked. It wasn't about the money, though the court ordered damages more than covered my legal expenses. It was about setting things right. The HOA held an emergency meeting not long after the ruling. From what I heard, several members called for the entire board to be replaced. Some even proposed dissolving the association altogether. Whether they did or not, I didn't care. They could run their little neighborhood however they wanted, as long as they kept their hands off my land. For the first time in years, the ranch felt quiet again. Not like something forgotten, but like something reclaimed. I had inherited more than property. I had inherited a fight, a legacy, a line in the dirt. And when the time came, I stood on it and didn't move. Once the last remnants of the HOA's so-called improvements were removed, I walked the land alone, just as my grandfather had done for decades. The silence was different now, cleaner, more honest. No more echo of kids playing on stolen tennis courts or sprinklers hissing through flower beds that never belonged. Just wind, dirt, and sky stretching over a piece of earth that had been in my family longer than any of those houses had stood. I ran my fingers along the old fence posts, some leaning, others still firm, and made a note to restore them all, not just to mark the boundary, but to remind anyone who passed where this land began and ended. I brought in a small team to help clear the debris, reseed the flattened patches, and start repairs on the weather-beaten barn. We found remnants of the old horse corral, half swallowed by weeds, and unearthed the rusted gate my grandfather once painted red. I didn't want to turn the ranch into anything grand or flashy. I just wanted it to breathe again, to be what it always was, simple, strong, and free. At night, I started camping out under the stars, like we used to do when I was a kid. The coyotes still howled in the distance, and the owls still called from the trees. Life was returning to the land, slowly but steadily. I even planted a few saplings near the creek bed, the kind my grandfather said would outlive us both. Maybe someday I'd pass the ranch on to someone else, someone who'd walk its edges with the same pride, someone who'd know its history. But for now it was mine again, every inch, and nothing, not threats, not lawsuits, not shiny fences, was ever going to take it from me again. Looking back, the fight wasn't just about land, it was about the principle of standing firm when someone tries to take what's rightfully yours. I never expected to be dragged into a legal war with a homeowners association, much less one I never joined, but life has a way of testing you when you least expect it. They assumed I'd fold, that I'd see a number like $350,000 and run. But what they didn't understand was that this ranch wasn't just property, it was legacy, memory, blood, and I wasn't going anywhere. If there's one thing I learned through all of this, it's that silence is permission. If I'd ignored that letter, if I'd let them claim even 1 inch without question, I would have handed over more than just land. I would have handed over my grandfather's name, his values, his stubborn belief that some things aren't for sale. And in today's world, where paper trails and legal tricks can outweigh common sense, it's up to us to speak up, even when the odds feel stacked. So here's my message to anyone reading this. Check your boundaries, literally and figuratively. Don't assume someone else is playing fair just because they're wearing a tie or hiding behind a boardroom. Know your rights. Protect what matters, because no one will fight for your land, your name, or your story the way you will. And if they ever come knocking, remember, sometimes the quietest piece of dirt carries the loudest voice when you choose to stand on it.